43 black soldiers refused orders to stand by for riot duty at the Democratic National Convention. One said, "The people we are supposed to control, the rioters, are probably our own race. We shouldn't have to go out there and do wrong to our own people." 9,000 miles away in war-ravaged Vietnam, 200 black prisoners seized control of the Army jail at Long Binh, burned buildings to smoldering embers, beat guards and other prisoners, and then they repurposed Army blankets into makeshift dashikis and built African drums out of barrels. They occupied the stockade for weeks. In Nilingen, West Germany, 2 white soldiers stabbed 3 black soldiers to death. At Fort McClellan, Alabama, somebody called the commander's office to warn that black soldiers who'd been meeting off post were headed back to burn it down. Another man called a few minutes later. "When the riot starts," he said, "tell Colonel Hip we're going to turn the weapons on him. Black power, baby, Ho Chi Minh." An Army major in Saigon, a man with an Army Commendation Medal and a Bronze Star, released an 8-page statement to the press claiming that the U.S. Army was the strongest citadel of racism in the face of the earth. And the editors at the New York Times ran that story next to another story about an older African-American couple who had gotten news that one of their sons was missing in combat in Vietnam, the same day they'd gotten a letter from the wife of another son who was a soldier in Germany, telling them that they weren't able to find housing because of their race and that the Army wasn't doing anything about it. In 1970 at Fort Carson, Colorado, a white soldier working part-time as a filling station attendant murdered the head of the Black Studies program at the local university. That sparked a confrontation between 35 MPs and 150 black soldiers armed with handguns and a stash of M1 carbines. At Fire Support Base Buttons, close to the Cambodian border, a few dozen black soldiers debated how to, quote, force Whitey to pay attention to the blacks without injuring anyone, and they fragged 2 helicopters. The following year, in South Korea, 100 black soldiers attacked a local bar that had shifted its focus from black soldiers to white soldiers. By 1972, in West Germany, officers and NCOs were refusing to enter barracks unless they were armed. "Race is my problem," one white NCO told a reporter in West Germany. "Not the Russians, not Vietnam. Race." Time magazine called it the war within the war. In fact, there was a whole lot less conflict among men in combat. But if you put it bluntly, the large majority of the U.S. Army was not on the front lines in Vietnam. And during the Vietnam era, racial conflicts spanned the range from fire bases in Vietnam to installations in West Germany, Korea, Thailand, and Okinawa, and it spread into the streets of surrounding cities. That wasn't supposed to be the story. Many Americans, black and white, civilian and in uniform, had seen the U.S. military as a model of racial progress. Flawed, absolutely, but still a sign of hope for the future. And the Army had embraced that narrative, self-serving in a way. "I see only one color and that's OD, olive drab." Or, "Same mud, same blood." In that version, the U.S. Army was colorblind. Black soldiers were starting to insist that that absolutely was not the case. Now, it's absolutely true that the problem of race and the discrimination and prejudice that created it was not new to the U.S. Army or restricted to the U.S. Army. And I could spend a whole talk on that history. But in the months and years following the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr., black enlisted men, and it was almost without exception men and almost without exception enlisted men, were beginning to challenge the Army's status quo. Some of these men offered thoughtful analysis and carefully considered programs. Some of them turned to violence. Most of them were at neither extreme. But in various ways, many African American servicemen demanded attention to their status as black men and to the problems they faced within the U.S. Army. They objected to racist graffiti, They refused to tolerate being called boy or to the casual use of racial epithets. They complained about unfairness in the military justice system. They pointed out how very few black officers there were. They challenged the status quo. What resulted was often explosive, often because white soldiers were provocative, but in part because there were so many angry and unwilling draftees, men of all races, who had little investment in the Army as an institution. At the same time, Cold War tensions were escalating. The situation in the Middle East was getting more and more volatile. The war in Vietnam was failing, and military leaders were facing what they understood to be a very volatile strategic environment. And some of them, top military leaders, came to believe that the growing racial crisis threatened the Army's ability to fulfill its mission of national defense. So their logic went, if this racial crisis was so disruptive that it threatened the Army's ability to defend the nation, it had become a problem they had to address. Now, there were certainly leaders within the Army, black and white, who believed that racial justice was critically important, that it was a moral or ethical issue, but the intensity of focus that the Army as an institution brought to the problem was because racial conflict seemed to threaten its very purpose in being. Okay. So what I'm going to do for the rest of the time is to talk about how the Army as an institution tried to combat what Army leaders started calling the problem of race. And what I'm doing here is shifting what the usual focus is, which is usually on those people who are demanding change, whose situations are such that they are trying to fight for rights, and saying that if we don't understand how institutions tried to address change, we're missing a critical part of the story. So if we want to understand how the Army as an institution made sense of and tried to solve this problem, we have to think about how the Army functions as an institution. We have to understand its institutional logic. I should have put this up before. And by that, I mean, wait one second. Yeah. By that, I mean the ways that the U.S. Army, in a specific historical era, defined its mission and purpose, the regulations and the practices and the procedures that governed its actions, and how it as an institution understands its own culture and history, even if those understandings are contested. The Army's institutional logic made the problem of race unavoidable during the Vietnam era. It shaped how the Army defined the problem, how it had tried to deal with the problem, what difficulties various units encountered as they tried solutions, and what solutions were more and less likely to be implemented and to succeed or fail. Okay, so how does the Army as an institution attempt to deal with the problem of race? Okay, two key moves. First of all, in 1969, both the Secretary and the Chief of the U.S. Army said that race was the Army's central concern, second only to the U.S. war in Vietnam. And given the Cold War status at that point, that's a pretty amazing concern. Okay. Next, and strikingly, the Army started to shift away from its claims of colorblindness and to adopt a positive race-conscious approach. Not without contestation. But in 1969, Stanley Reeser, the Secretary of the Army, made what was a really path-breaking speech to the Association of the U.S. Army. And he said, some leaders will say, with the best of intentions, for me there's only one color, and that's OD. And yes, of course, he said, to the extent of treating everybody fairly, that's the goal. But he said, quote, putting black and white citizens in green uniforms doesn't mean that their different experiences, their different backgrounds, their outlooks can be ignored. And then he said, a Negro in uniform does not cease to be a Negro and become a soldier instead. He becomes a Negro soldier. And he went on to make a similar claim for white soldiers. So the Secretary claimed that, in addition to combating racism, a negative, the Army needed to define racial identity as a potentially positive force, or at least one that couldn't be ignored. Okay. Big claims. How does it work? What actually happens? That's what I did in the book, and you might compare it to throwing pasta against the wall to see what sticks, because people had no clue what to do, and they tried all sorts of stuff. But as the institutional army said, okay, this is a huge problem we got to solve, it had specific tools that it could turn to. It's an institution that's built on principles of command, of rank hierarchy, of authority and obedience, and so when superiors issue orders, subordinates are required to obey them. As the Army tried to create specific and detailed regulations, its members were required to follow them, and there were things to do if they didn't follow them. Nothing in civilian society compared to the tools that the Army could bring to bear to the power and reach of military command. Soldiers belonged to the Army 24 hours a day. Nothing in civilian life compared. So a commander who is intent on solving the problem of race might not ever change hearts and minds, but he, and in this case it was almost always a he, had a pretty good bet that they could change behavior or make a good start on it. Okay, so given this authority, it's not surprising that in the first place the Army looked in terms of how to address this growing crisis was to leadership and command authority. The centrality of command was essential to the way that the Army's institutional logic and organizational practice worked. But as Army leaders started to struggle with their racial crisis, some started to realize that Army structures of command, for all their utility, were not an unmixed blessing. Okay, first, and most basically, commanders, whether they led a platoon or a brigade, were human. They were products of a society divided by race, and a great majority of them were white. Anybody with significant authority in the Army at the cusp of the 1970s had come of age before Rosa Parks refused to move to the back of the bus, before brave teenagers had integrated Little Rock High School, before 4 college students had sat down at that Woolworths and asked to be served a cup of coffee in Greensboro, North Carolina, before 250,000 Americans had marched for jobs and freedom in Washington, D.C. And those few senior officers who were black had risen to those ranks through huge amounts of talent and ability. But part of that ability was to figure out how to navigate a white-dominated system. By the end of the 1970s, some white officers wholeheartedly supported racial justice. Others not so much. But even those people well into positive territory were shaped by their upbringing. And it's difficult not to be shocked today by some of the relatively common blind spots and insensitivities that you see in that era. Okay, so 1971. General Michael S. Davison is assigned to head the U.S. Army Europe, and a large part of his mission, in addition to sort of forestalling Soviet invasion, is to manage the explosive racial crisis that's going on there. About 5 months after he took command, he scheduled a conference on race relations, and commanders, corps level on down, weren't required to attend, but he kind of thought they would since he was going to be there for the whole thing. The 2 corps commanders showed up for Davison's speech, and then they took off. And the only people left for the conference were the equal opportunity officers who were required to be there. And at this point, General Davison said, it became clear to me that I really had to get that mule's attention, and the best way to do that was to hit him over the head a couple of times with a 2x4. Davison had a pretty clear idea what his mandate was, and he was willing to use the tools at hand. So what did he do? Well, there were several USAREUR company and battalion commanders that he figured weren't taking the mission of race relations seriously enough. He relieved them of their command. That got their attention. The Army as an institution instituted a less drastic but broader version of that by starting in 1972 to add to the officer efficiency reports, the evaluations that officers faced every year, a special interest item on how well they were handling race relations. That gave officers an incentive to perform. Okay, so an incentive to perform problems that they're facing in their own units that are definitely disruptive. What did they do confronting this? Back to institutional tools. Army officers, of course, have authority over those below them on the chain of command. Sometimes that structure allowed leaders to circumvent or minimize the individual problems that subordinates. That's a plus. But the chain of command also offered a structural problem, and that's the second part of the mixed blessings. Each step down the chain of command offered a potential for things to go awry. After all, it's not the intention that matters, it's the implementation. And each step up the chain of command offered subordinates a chance to shift a narrative, to obscure a problem. There's rarely a reward for noting that the sky's falling, even if it's true, right? So there was lots of incentive to downplay the negative, to sidetrack complaints, to minimize crisis, just as there was incentive to inflate body count in combat or to exaggerate the success of a mission. Now, emerging Army wisdom was saying that racial conflict stemmed from a, quote, failure to communicate. And memo after memo, obsessed with leadership, focused on the chain of command. Senior commanders were out of touch with their men. They relied too heavily on their subordinates, who had no incentive to admit to problems that were beyond their capacity to solve or to pass along complaints that reflected badly on them. And time again, according to this narrative, commanders were caught out. They were surprised when things erupted under their command. They weren't aware of what was going on. Okay, lots of explanation. What happened? Let's look at West Germany, where racial conflict had reached a full-scale crisis. Since the mid-1960s, the Pentagon had been using the 7th Army in Germany, this highly disciplined fighting force that was charged with holding the line against a Soviet invasion of Europe, as a reserve, siphoning off men, officers, and equipment for the U.S. war in Vietnam. There was little continuity of leadership. Equipment for training was scarce. Enlisted men lived in barracks that one officer compared negatively to the accommodations in the Nuremberg Zoo. Troops were bored and frustrated. Morale was poor. Discipline was weak. Violence was common. And young black enlisted men, men who come of age in an era of black power, were ever more likely to seek solidarity with other black troops, to demand to be heard, and for some to use violence when their demands were ignored. Many commanders had not figured out how to handle this growing crisis. So one May night, 1970, about 50 black GIs gathered outside a headquarters building and demanded to see the commander. There was a black sergeant who was speaking for the group, and he told the captain on duty, a white captain, that if they didn't get to meet with the commander, General Garth, there was going to be trouble. The captain was not sympathetic. He called General Garth, who, after the conversation, sent his inspector general and the unit chaplain, 2 majors, to hear the men's complaints. The black soldiers were not pleased. There was some shouting. Some men walked out. But the group's leader, Sergeant Hobson, the man that Garth's aide, the captain, described as the, quote, Pied Piper, who was able to calm or incite his men at will, convinced most of them to come back to the table. So this meeting with the 2 majors and the group of men who had a list of complaints, it was still going on at 9 p.m. when someone tossed a hand grenade through a window of the mess hall. There were about 20 men in there, officers and enlisted men, black and white, who had just finished playing a softball game and were hanging out in the mess hall afterwards. 10 of them were injured. Somebody found another grenade nearby, along with a set of makeshift explosives, and a 3rd grenade went off under an unoccupied tracked personnel carrier. Now, the fragging did get General Garth to headquarters, where he was confronted by a furious Sergeant Hobson. Oops, sorry. Hobson told General Garth that if he had just come down to meet with these soldiers, none of this would have happened. He raised his voice, he called the commanding officer incompetent, and he threatened to report the problems of racism to the proper authorities. Shortly thereafter, Hobson was charged with attempted murder and conspiracy, identified as the ringleader of the group of black militants who planned and carried out the fragging and the attempted arson. It turned out that this sergeant had been a gang leader on Chicago's West Side, known by the street name Caveman. Jim Hobson had cycled through 31 foster homes in less than 7 years. He had slept on the streets from the age of 16. had been convicted 43 separate times by the same boys' court judge for the crimes of theft, battery, burglary, and mob action. So, good narrative. If racial unrest was, as many white Army commanders wanted, hoped, believed, due to just a few militant black troublemakers, not to the underlying conditions in which black soldiers served, Hobson was a perfect example of the problems they faced. But in the end, this bragging was much less about black militancy than it had been about a failure of leadership. And some came to see it as such at the time. Garth, speaking to a journalist the following September, said that when he took command, race problems had been the furthest thing from his mind. He said, "I just never given it a thought." Then bang, we had that hand grenade incident. Now that claim, if true, was pretty much indefensible. If Garth hadn't realized that race relations were explosive in his command by that point, he was badly out of touch with what was going on. And if, on the other hand, he saw the problems but he didn't take them seriously, that too was a failure of leadership. He may well have been justified in refusing to the summons of a group of angry soldiers on that May night. In subsequent years, Army guidance said that doing such, meeting with aggrieved, quote, crowds in racially charged situations only lent legitimacy to those tactics. But sending a couple of majors in his place appeared to the men who had gathered as dismissive, and in many ways it was. But Garth's greatest leadership failure may have been in discounting Hobson's leadership. Hobson had been abandoned at birth, had grown up unwanted, he had joined a gang at the age of 15, but in that gang, Jim Hobson had made a group of ill-disciplined and violent young men see him as their leader. And by the age of 20, had walked away from the vice lords, despite the physical threat that entailed, because two nuns had showed him a different path. Joining the military was his way out of Chicago. But given his record, those 43 convictions, it took some doing to get him into the Army. And the boys' court judge wrote a letter to President Johnson making the case to have him admitted. When he left the Army, once in the Army, he volunteered for Vietnam, even though he had a position as a drill instructor in Fort Jackson. That former gang member had been awarded 2 Bronze Stars in the Vietnamese Cross for Gallantry. And when he came back to Chicago between Vietnam and Germany, he was welcomed with Chicago's Medal of Honor. He had marched with Martin Luther King in 1966 in Marquette Park, and he told Mayor Daley and the city council about the racial problem in Vietnam. He said, "It's bad. It's second only to the war." Now, 24-year-old Sergeant Hobson was a shake-and-bake sergeant. He wasn't a lifer. No one would mistake him for what people at the time referred to as a, quote, Uncle Tom. His qualities of leadership far preceded his time in the Army, and he was not one to let things ride. So when he ended up in the worst of USAREUR's racial mess in the spring of 1970, he emerged as a leader. And on that May night in question, he had been without question on the side of the men who massed outside headquarters. But he went with them to headquarters in an attempt to prevent violence, not by undermining the men's claims, but by seeking change. Hobson had tried to make the general's aide, that white captain, understand that the situation was serious, that it might easily erupt. But all the white captain could hear was a black man threatening violence. In the end, Hobson was acquitted of the charges of attempted murder and conspiracy, the most serious charges. He was instead convicted of disobedience and stripped of rank. He had supporters in Chicago who raised over $7,000, most of it from blood donations, to hire a civilian defense attorney for Hobson's trial, and one of those people went over to testify in his trial, carried a message from Mayor Daley, who you may know was not the strongest advocate of racial justice. She quoted the mayor, "Jim is a good boy. I want him back in Chicago. I want to send the young man to college. I need him." Now, nobody had been killed in this hand grenade incident, but in the words of one reporter, it sent tremors from Bremerhaven to Bavaria through the entirety of the 7th Army. And in the 1st Division, General Garth made some serious changes. "Any commander who thinks he doesn't have a racial situation is a fool," he said. publicly. And moving forward from this attack, even as Sergeant Hobson remained incarcerated, the general made it his business to speak personally with every black soldier in the division. Now, maybe he realized that relying on his aide's take on the situation had been a bad idea. It didn't serve him well. Or maybe, post-fragging, he heard some version of what another black sergeant in the division told a reporter later. He said, "Your commanders may have the best intentions in the world, but they don't come down the chain of command without getting balled up by bigots and rednecks all along the line." So what he did was speak to black enlisted men. But stepping around the chain of command doesn't fit easily into Army logic, and it's not an unalloyed good. One of Garth's aides complained that they'd gotten to the point after the fragging that privates felt comfortable interrupting the general's conversations to complain about the quality of their breakfast, and that he was spending so much time having an open door and trying to talk to men in his command about what was going on so that he was in touch with things that he didn't have any time to do the things that he was supposed to do. That aide sounds disaffected to me, but what also is happening is the subordinates in command were complaining that this was undermining their authority over their men. Okay, over to Fort Jackson, which was in 1970 a really challenging command because it was full of Vietnam returnees with their last weeks in service, many of whom cared little about the Army and its rules. Race relations were bad. Violence was not uncommon. And after a particularly explosive conversation with a group of young enlisted men, the post commander set up a race relations council, something that had been emerging as a kind of ad hoc solution in various places where commanders were understanding that they were not understanding what was going on in their command. So what they did was to create a small group of enlisted men. Sometimes it was multiracial, sometimes it was black men, sometimes elected by their peers, and give them extraordinary access to the commander. At Fort Carson, the commander met with them every single day, which is kind of a big deal. Totally outside the chain of command. So this model, again, is not without some problems. Some of these young men suddenly, at least in their minds, placed above all of those people who had been telling them what to do, given direct access to a two-star general every single day, tended to push the boundaries a little bit. Guidelines that insisted that communication should be frank, honest, and authentic sometimes was more than commanders had bargained for. The Washington Post described one young black soldier calling his division commander a pig to his face. Fort Carson wrote a report on what it had learned and said it had been, quote, necessary to accept the abrasiveness of some of the natural black leaders as a very small price for their cooperation in the dynamic but volatile and delicate area of human relations. That's why it's so hard to write military history, is because all of the sources sound like that. And you start writing that way, it's like, nobody will read this. Okay, so a commander might decide in the broader interest of communication, and it is the 1970s and there's an enormous emphasis on authenticity, to accept some posturing of youth. But what if the more significant charge is that he had undermined the authority of junior officers and NCOs? This new model solved one problem. Nothing got lost on the way up the chain of command. But how does an institution that's built on obedience and rank hierarchy offer an alternative path? There's no good answer. The Deputy Commanding General at the U.S. Army Vietnam, Frank Mildren, was so appalled by the practice that he sent out a memo in all, not in all caps, just the key parts in caps. Take your complaints through the chain of command is as sound in this modern Army, he wrote, as it was in earlier times. But from Fort Carson, General Rogers had a more practical endorsement. He said there was a, quote, militant black activist who'd served on the Racial Harmony Council, and he had warned him that violence was coming. And because of this warning, they'd been able to head it off. And Rogers said that means that the Race Relations Council justified both its existence and its violation of the chain of command because its purpose was to avoid disruption and violence, and it had succeeded doing that. All right. In the end, it's worth noting that despite their fundamental violation of Army practice, the Race Relation Councils were still leadership-based solutions. At Fort Carson and elsewhere, commanders sought what they saw as natural, charismatic leaders among primarily the young black enlisted men, recognizing the unofficial roles they were already playing, and offered them standing in a form of authority. Now, this may have been co-optation, but it came with the ear of the commanding general in a time when there were significant problems to be addressed and a very un-Army ability to speak frankly. The drawback, though, was that these men weren't lifers. Army leaders had a constant struggle to identify and cultivate the next natural leader, and the next, and the next. So, okay, in this period of racial crisis, Army leaders worked from the premise that commanders were responsible and that leadership was the solution. And they further institutionalized that responsibility by making effective race relations one of the things that officers were being evaluated on. As a solution to the problem of race, the Army's focus on command was the most in keeping with Army tradition and practice. Endorsing command responsibility was neither bold nor disruptive. Nonetheless, in service of that most traditional principle of command responsibility, commanders were willing to challenge the fundamental Army principle and practice of observing the chain of command. Okay, let me give you one more quick example here. All right. Leadership's the obvious answer. But this is also a period of cultural nationalism, a period of black pride. This is definitely not the Army, okay? And many black soldiers, conscripted, draft-motivated volunteers, wanted to show black pride. They wanted to claim their black identity. Culture was crucial. Soul music, urban or African clothing, and afros. It's amazing going through Army records how many serious racial conflicts began over the choice of whether or not music was soul or country and western. Amazing. How many Article 15s, non-judicial punishments, were issued for failing to obey a legal order that was about something like a haircut or wearing an item of clothing that was not approved as a statement of identity? Okay, so how did the Army try to lessen its conflict over culture? Okay, the way the problem is defined is going to dictate what element of the Army is responsible for it. And the first place that the issue of race and culture found purchase, anybody want to guess? The PX, right? PX officials whose job is to provide consumer goods to service personnel on institutions throughout the world had the significant insight that the Army defaulted to white in so many spheres, and that many black soldiers didn't find the cultural elements that supported their life choices. So they said, we can fix that. They'll solve the problem within their sphere. They'll change what the PX stocks. So it's the Army, right? PX officials do extensive research on what black customers tended to buy in the civilian world. They sent people out to observe in department stores in cities with large black populations. It was just, and they came up with a long list of, quote, ethnic products, not doing still a great job in not marginalizing people, right? To be regularly stocked in the 3,300 PX the exchanges worldwide. In Korea, they started stocking afro combs. They ordered 500. They sold out within a matter of minutes. It's going to be a challenge, but that's what they do. They manage inventory. They can do this. It sounds peripheral in a way, but when you think about it, the PX was either the third or the fourth largest retail institution in the world. And when it started ordering soul music and stocking Ebony magazine, and for Christmas, at this point, 1 in 5 dolls was black, That made a huge difference, not only for the soldiers and their families, but also for the black-owned businesses that were creating these products. It was a big deal. And plenty of soldiers are quite happy about these changes. But black pride is not simply a matter of consumer goods, and it can't just be purchased at the PX. So as racial tensions grew and anti-military sentiments started spreading more and more throughout the Army across race, the Afro becomes a huge issue. Again, not the Army. Becomes a huge issue. Fort Bragg had a series of seminars, and they found that the participants, black and white, were obsessed with hair policy. A survey at Fort Carson in March 1970 found that 1 in 5 enlisted men listed hair as their top concern. It is 1970. 2/3 put hair in their top 4. For perspective, it's less than 10 months after the Battle of Hamburger Hill, and 1 in 5 servicemen are saying hair is their biggest concern. Now, it's important to stress that Army regulations about hair were not racially neutral. The proper haircut was often referred to as a white wall, right? Which was also used as slang for white soldiers. And lots of young soldiers wanted long hair. It was the 70s. I once, this is really embarrassing. It was 1968, I think, and I broke up with my boyfriend in 7th grade because his mother made him get a haircut before the dance. One of my less proud moments. I still feel like apologizing to him, but I found him on Facebook. He's not a good guy. It's okay. PX again came up with a partial solution. They found an experienced black barber and sent him around the world to teach people, local barbers, how to cut black hair. And they authorized what they called an afro. I don't think a single black person called it an afro, but the Army did. But they stopped charging extra for cutting black hair, and they taught people better techniques in any case. But even so, the problem was inconsistency. You could pass an inspection in the morning, and then by the afternoon, a different officer can, say that your haircut isn't appropriate. Both black soldiers and white soldiers believed the other group was getting more latitude. There's a solution to that. How does the Army solve a problem like that?
Uniformity.
Yes, uniformity. Uniformity through regulations. All right. No specific mention of hair, 1967, up to 37 words.
Wow.
Right? This is in the space of a year. This is what it looks like now.
Oh my gosh.
And a lot of it is because women are included, right? It made it much more complicated. But what a lot of young enlisted black men wanted, in addition to signaling their black identity and black pride, goes beyond their hair. I love this picture. You can see the pictures for white haircuts are fairly long by Army standards as well. People wanted to be able to wear soul bands, unity bands, brotherhood bracelets, etc. Here is an attempt to create regulations for how that can work. People wanted to be able to greet each other with the dap. They wanted to give a black power salute instead of a traditional salute. It's a dilemma for the Army. Expanded PX offerings fits really well within Army logic. I mean, that's what the PX does. It sells stuff to people. Cultural symbols, that violates a whole series of Army practices and regulations. Signs of individual identity are in conflict with the uniformity, there we go, that's central to Army service, and alternate group identities challenge the primacy of the identity of the soldier. I mean, the purpose of the Army, the Afro at that point, is to signal black pride and black identity, to reject a kind of uniformity that's based on a presumption of whiteness. But some of these symbolic acts defy the logic of military order, discipline, hierarchy, rank. The dap, okay. Does a sergeant dap with a private? Does a captain? What about when it's purposely used to slow down the mess line as a kind of form of nonviolent resistance to white authority? What about the clenched fists black power salute? Was it a symbol of solidarity and pride? Does it symbolize defiance? Some people certainly thought so. There are a lot of officers who aren't wild about accepting cultural symbols. They see it as permissive. They see it as asking for trouble. But USAREUR's Commander-in-Chief, General Davison, the white General Davison, endorsed black pride symbols. The black General Davison was less willing to do so. Not as a long-term plan, just a temporary response. He said that an institution that relies on, he said, we'll do it temporarily and we'll get past it. But an institution that relies on official policies and regulations doesn't really easily incorporate flexible, unofficial leniency. So by 1972, the Department of the Army is considering an Army-wide policy to allow all troops, regardless of race or ethnicity, to wear, quote, culturally oriented items while in uniform. But there's an issue here. If, only in specific commands even, commanders decide to recognize the importance of black identity and accept the use of various cultural symbols, even just temporarily, and to a very specific end, and in a very specific circumstance, you can't limit the use of cultural symbols to African Americans alone. You see what's coming? Everybody see what's coming? If one group's cultural symbols are acceptable, why aren't the symbols of another group? If black soldiers can display pride in black identity, why can't white soldiers display pride in white identity, or maybe in white Southern identity? And then there we have the Confederate flag, which was being flown anyway. But it was then treated as equivalent officially. Symbol, symbol. The way the Army got around that was institutional culture. We're not flying any flags except the ones that are the United States, the Republic of Vietnam, and the Minuteman Award. No flags. Not going to address the problem of cultural symbols, we're just going to get rid of flags. The universality of regulations created a conundrum. Even as Army race relations experts attempted to explain, remember I mentioned blind spots, that both the, quote, unity slave solidarity bracelet and the Confederate flag were symbols of group pride that were easily misunderstood by members of other groups. Okay, I talked about two different approaches here in the context of institutional logic, and I can talk about others if you want in questions, but in the end, okay, first of all, did it work? Well, yeah, in that the problem Army leaders defined was instability and the threat to the institution's ability to fulfill its mission. The goal was to stabilize the institution. They did, not solely through these actions. A lot of external things happened that made a difference, but yeah, they did. But second, as an institution, the Army is big on lessons learned. Okay, so what are the lessons learned here that I would propose? What's the takeaway? Okay, most fundamentally, I'd say institutional logic matters. First of all, issues or groups of people that pose problems to the institution's mission tend to prompt response. And I am not advocating violence here. But for all the discussions of addressing the problem of race, and despite the fact that some programs certainly were focused at white GIs trying to say, we're going to figure out how to get you to stop provocations, we're going to teach you about African American history. The fact that they had some limited focus on groups ranging from Hispanics to Appalachian whites and Native Americans, they always defaulted back to the black-white conflict, and they always in that conflict focused on black men. Because that was the group, at least in the eye of leaders, that was causing a disruption that the Army as an institution had to address for its own interest. For some people who were seeking change, that was a tactical decision in their battle. Okay, second, institutional logic and the weight of the organization, culture, history, tradition, policy, practice fundamentally defines how an institution is going to define the problem and what solutions it's going to most directly try. But at the same time, institutions are not timeless. When leaders understand how institutional logic functions, they're better able to craft effective interventions and to anticipate and manage the kinds of problems that are going to stem from that logic. And this is something I think is really critical. It matters to people who are fighting for change too. Because if you're trying to force change, if you're trying to bring about change, understanding how an institution thinks, how to make that institution understand that change is in its own interest, is a very good first step. And understanding how to work within the system according to the institutional logic matters as well. But it also helps you to understand when you have to say, according to this institution's logic, this change will not happen. We have to step outside. We have to challenge the logic. It's not a self-contained system. Finally, a brief optimistic lesson. We talked today an awful lot about institutional racism, and they talked about institutional racism at this point too, using that phrase. And I spent a lot of time in the U.S. Army records from the Vietnam era, and I can say without reservation that institutional racism was widespread. But some people see an acknowledgement of the existence of institutional racism as a suggestion that everything is structural and thus individual acts don't make a whole lot of difference. And what I found going through this stuff time after time again is that individuals really mattered. Individuals did make a difference. For good or for ill, of course, but often for good. And in many cases, it was their hard-won understandings of how the institution functioned that allowed them to either effectively challenge institutional practice or to come up with solutions that were creative and that they were actually able to implement effectively. I'm going to end with that note of optimism. Thank you for your time. I've enjoyed being here. I'm happy to answer questions if you have any, and thanks again. Anybody? Yeah, Douglas.
I'm sure you considered this in the book, but I'd like to hear your thoughts on it. A lot of what you're talking about is generational conflict.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Because, white soldiers wanted to wear their hair long,
Yeah.
for example, as well. And, the officers are an older generation.
Yeah.
How do you deal with that in your book? Because I'm sure you do.
Yeah, a lot of it was generational conflict, and I think a lot of black NCOs and officers were criticized even more by young black enlisted men because they weren't acting in support of their actions. As far as hair goes, what happens after this period is that there becomes even more insistence on hair, and there's this huge crisis, and people are getting court-martialed right and left for refusing the lawful order to cut their hair. But it's mainly white soldiers, and the Army has no interest in allowing white soldiers to wear longer hair. I mean, the afro was part of trying to manage a crisis over race. And so they're basically saying no. I mean, because young white soldiers saw it as a badge of identity of being hip and being young. And, there was I think they allowed people in the reserves to wear wigs for a while. For training, because they didn't want to have, I'm a music producer. I cut my hair, there goes, right? And it's not just my date to the dance, there goes my livelihood. And so they would teach them how to use stockings so that they could wear short wigs for training during their brief training. A lot of it was generational, and there was a lot of talk about the generation gap, but they separated out race often. So sometimes they say this is a generational problem, but then they'd say, if this is not appropriate, they'd say there's the quote, new breed black. And then white soldiers are changing too, but it's black soldiers that are really changing. So let's just ignore the whites. We'll try and teach the white soldiers not to be such jerks. But what we really have to think about is what's going on with black soldiers. It's a great question, and it runs all the way through, and they never do a good job of it. I mean, there's all sorts of patronizing stuff from senior commanders about, the pluses of youth, and that, if you're an 18-year-old, you just want to, I don't know what, commit violence against the commander. So. Yeah.
We talked about failures of senior command,
Mm-hmm.
and we did mention Sergeant Hobson there as kind of trying to play a mitigating role.
Yeah.
But outside, like the shake and bake sergeants, the platoon sergeants, the first sergeants, the guys that are with their men every day, see them every day.
Yeah.
It seems like, if not more so, definitely a heavy burden rests on their failures as well. And how much responsibility do you place at the NCO Corps
Yeah.
and the failure of their culture?
So there was a lot of so the way the Army was looking at it, there was a lot of discussion that our junior officers and NCOs, by and large, have not been trained for this, and they don't know how to manage it. So they started trying to figure out how to train white junior officers and NCOs to manage racial crisis, because it was hard, and a lot of it wasn't something that you could actually manage well. I mean, some of it was the Inspector General there'd be a complaint that there was racism in a unit, and somebody would write a letter to his mother, who would then write the president, and then the Inspector General would come and they would do an investigation. Is there racism in this unit? And almost always they'd say there wasn't. But then they'd say things like, it would probably be better if the NCOs didn't call black enlisted men boy, or the racial epithets, which wasn't taken as a sign of racism. So, right. I think admirably what the Army leaders who were looking at this tried to do was to say, finally, top command is in charge and bears responsibility. But the fact that all officers and then NCOs were evaluated on how well they were managing race relations was something that was a sign that they were expecting to do it, and they created all sorts of training to try and help people figure out how to do it. There was one really, the major who wrote the piece about the Army being the citadel of racism. He was. There was a conflict where someone else who was a major with him should have intervened and helped him out, and he didn't do it because he said, I'm from Alabama, and anything I do, I don't know how to handle this. I don't know what to do. It's just going to look like I'm prejudiced. And the guy was probably the most hapless major in the Army in its entire history when you look at what he said. But on the other hand, he was right. He hadn't been trained how to handle any of these issues. So that's it. People bear responsibility. The people in immediate command. The real Army is at least company level or below for most people, right? So yeah, you're absolutely right. But I think it's good that by and large, as an institution, the Army said it's the senior commander's responsibility and fault, as opposed to downloading it, onto somebody who's leading a platoon. Yes.
Do you think that institutional racism kind of died out with the Vietnam War, or do you think it's still apparent in the Army?
I think that we need to recognize, the point about institutional racism is that it's built into institutions. And yeah, it continues, but I don't think it's nearly as extreme as it was during that period. And there have been a lot of steps that have been taken by the Army and the other institutions to try to become aware of the ways in which institutional racism functions. But it's a different situation of concern. So they did take actions that made things better. And that's something to hold on to. But it didn't, they solved their problem. They didn't solve the problem of racism. You see, that's the distinction. Their problem was something that was challenging the Army's stability. They solved that. They didn't solve racism, but they did probably make things better. So yeah, that's the fundamental question, isn't it?
Yeah, so you mentioned that one of the incentives that was changed was that they, at the senior levels, were on their officer evaluations, essentially, that they're judged how well they effectively manage race relations, correct?
But yeah, not just senior levels.
Yes,
yeah.
all the way down.
Yeah.
So number one, so was that like a quantifiable, like that was a formalized step on their evaluations? Mm-hmm. And yeah. Did the Army institute anything that was like quantifiable how they did that, or was it subjective all the way down the line? And if that was the case, when did the Army deem that as being done, where it dropped off of the...
I have been trying, I mean, it's now the sort of pro forma evaluation. It's like, you don't do anything to make things worse. And I've been trying to find when it disappeared. It's really hard to find the full policy, to find the full range. Things tend to disappear when they're changed. I need to go to the Center of Military History, where I think they probably have that full range, and just go through all of them and see when the OER changed. But that's a really important question. When did it stop being such a pressing concern that it was designated as a special interest and became just one of those things that sort of is listed, and as long as you don't really do something egregious, it's okay.
Did the Army institute any guidelines or metrics or how they were judging, like how effectively it was being, their standards are being met to qualify as...
It had some subordinate questions, but I mean, so much of this was subordinate. I mean, it was subjective anyway, and so there was conversation about, how are we supposed to measure this? And this is just putting one more thing that, is subjective in. And there were various segregationists in Congress, white segregationists in Congress, who protested that, this is destroying the Army, and that, these are invalid criteria for people to be measured against, and such. So, again, it's one of those things that got people's attention. Sometimes it wasn't fair because you didn't necessarily have control over a very explosive situation, but it was meant to signal that this has to be a priority. Those are great questions, and the institution never had a real clear metric, and that's always hard when you're evaluating something.
Yeah, so the Army now, there we are, and we mentioned this with Progressive, but they have a similar, slightly worded differently bullet about sexual harassment response.
Yeah.
And so, again, it's still largely pro forma.
Yeah.
Unless something happens or you commander, you mishandle that case, and a bomb gets dropped on you. But
right. Yeah.
Otherwise, it was largely pro forma. So I can only imagine it was very similar.
Yeah, this wasn't pro forma at that point.
Yeah.
This was an item of special interest, and there was an enormous amount of attention being put on it, in part because the Army wanted to look like it was trying to do something.
Right.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if you could talk about the Army's efforts to address racism in the broader context of American institutions' efforts to address racism, and to some degree evaluate who's being more progressive. In particular, I'm thinking that kind of towards the end of the examples you're talking about, there's some real meaningful efforts at affirmative action in local government, for example, during this time period.
Yeah.
Is the Army considering something that looks like affirmative action? Are they leading the way, or are they following?
I wouldn't say leading, but the Army definitely created they started with affirmative actions plans, which didn't necessarily mean in terms of promotion and assignments, but just anything affirmative to be done to address the problems of racism. But they did implement in 1972 and again in 1975 affirmative action plans that used numerical goals, because the shortage of black officers, especially senior black officers, was extraordinary. West Point would have, maybe on a good year, 6 black cadets, and had none from the period of, I think, before World War I on up until sometime in the 1950s. And so they're trying to think hard about how to get more black, and you have to grow your own. So it's not like you can go out and find some person who's doing great and just hire them in. So yeah, they created numerical goals. And they worked with the NAACP and with the Urban League to try and build ROTC programs at HBCUs, and also they denied funding to any any institution's ROTC program that was segregated or would not accept black cadets. And I think it was gosh, was it here? They were very proud because not only had they brought in 5 black cadets in this entering class, but they had all taken positions of leadership in the cadet corps. So they did. The problem though is I mean, I don't know if you've seen the various articles about how the Army, you know, is still so short in terms of black officers. It depends on what you're comparing it with, because if you're comparing it with the proportion of the population, especially people who are old enough to serve, the Army's doing great. If you compare it to the percentage of college-educated men and women who could become officers, the Army's doing really great. If you compare it to the percentage of people serving in the enlisted ranks, it's not good at all, right? It all depends on what you're comparing it against. And so there's reason to say what you need to compare it against is the enlisted ranks, but it's a sort of different pool in general. So that's hard to answer. But it was military services who came out really strongly to support affirmative action in universities, because, you know, the argument is a compelling argument that we need a military that represents the nation, that represents the diversity of the nation, and where we're going to get officers is from colleges and universities. And if we don't allow at least some race consciousness in our admissions process, we're going to miss a lot of really good people who would make excellent officers. And we need them. And that was a compelling argument that was made in support of you know, both Michigan and Texas's Supreme Court cases about affirmative action and college admissions. So, you know, not only did the Army implement this, not always successfully, but there was a program in place. But a lot of senior military leaders came out and made the case for why it was important and why we need to think about this to the nation's benefit. So it's not the individual benefit, it's the nation's benefit, they said. I just finished the affirmative action chapter. I've got all sorts of statistics in my head. It's frightening.
One more question? Any other questions? Okay, well, please join me in thanking again Dr. Beth Bailey for a very fascinating talk. Thank you. And thank you all for coming tonight.